Section 26 of the House of the White Shadows. Recording is in the public domain. The House of the White Shadows by B.L. Farjeon. Section 26. Book 5, Chapters 1 through 3. Book 5. The Doom of Gautran. Chapter 1. Adelaide strives to propitiate Pierre Lamont. The following night was even darker than the preceding one had been. In the afternoon, portents of a coming storm were apparent in the sky. Low mutterings of thunder in the distance travelled faintly to the ears of the occupants of the House of White Shadows. The Advocate's wife shuddered as she heard the sounds. "There are only two things in the world I am afraid of," she said to Pierre Lamont, "and those are thunder and lightning. When I was a little child, a dreadful thing occurred to me. I was playing in a garden when a storm came on. I was all alone, and it was some distance to the house. The storm broke so suddenly that I had not time to reach shelter without getting myself drenched. I dare say, though, I should have run through it had I not been frightened by the flashes of lightning that seemed to want to cut me in two. I flew behind a tree, and stood there trembling. Every time a flash came, I shut my eyes tight and screamed. But the storm did not allow my cries to be heard. You can imagine the state I was in. It would not have mattered, except for the wetting, had I kept my eyes closed, but like a little fool I opened them once, and just at that moment a flash seemed to strike the tree behind which I stood. I can almost hear the shriek I gave as I fell and fainted dead away. There, lying on the wet grass, I was found. A dreadful looking object I must have been. They carried me into the house, and when I was conscious of what was passing around me, I asked why they did not light the gas. The fact is, I was quite blind, and remained so for several days. Was it not shocking? I shall never, never forget my fright. Can you imagine anything more dreadful than being struck blind? To be born blind cannot be half as bad, for one does not know what one loses, never having seen the flowers and the fields and the beautiful skies. But to enjoy them, and then to lose them! It is altogether too horrible to think of. She was very gracious to the old lawyer during the afternoon. "Do you know," she said, "I can't quite make up my mind whether to be fond or frightened of you." "Be fond of me," said Pierre Lamont, with a queer look. "I shall see how you behave. I am afraid you are very clever. I don't like clever people, they are so suspicious, pretending to know everything always." "I am very simple," said Pierre Lamont, laughing inwardly. He knew that she wanted to propitiate him. "And beauty can lead me by a silken thread." "Is that another of your compliments? I declare, you speak as if you were a young man." She did, indeed, desire to win Pierre Lamont entirely to her, and she would have endured much to make him her friend instead of her enemy. Christian Almer had told her that the old lawyer had slept in the next room to his, and she had set herself the task of sounding the old fellow to ascertain whether his suspicions were aroused, and whether she had anything to fear from him. She could not help saying to herself what a fool Mother Denise, who looked after the household arrangements, was to put him so close to Christian. "I do believe," thought Adelaide, "that she did it to spite me." Her mind, however, was quite at ease after chatting with the old lawyer. "I am so glad we are friends," she said to him. "It is altogether so much nicer." Pierre Lamont looked reproachfully at her, and asked how she could ever have supposed he was anything but her most devoted admirer. "Lawyers are so fond of mischief," she replied, "that if it does not come to them ready made, they manufacture it for themselves." "I am no longer a lawyer," he said. "If I were 20 years younger I should call myself a lover." "If you were 20 years younger," she rejoined gaily, "I should not sit and listen to your nonsense." Being called from his side, she turned and gave him an arch look. "All that only makes the case stronger, my lady," he said inwardly. "You cannot deceive me with your wiles." CHAPTER II. GAUTRAN seeks John Vanbrugh. During the chief part of the day, Gautran concealed himself in the woods. Twice had he ventured to present himself to his fellow creatures. He was hungry, and in sore need of food, and he went to a wayside inn, and called for cold meat and bread and brandy. "Can you pay for it?" asked the innkeeper suspiciously. Gautran threw down a gold piece. The innkeeper took it, bit it, turned it over and over, rang it on the wooden table, and then set the food before Gautran. The murderer ate ravenously. It was the first sufficient meal he had eaten for days. The innkeeper gave him his change, and he ordered more meat and brandy, and paid for them. While he was disposing of this, 2 men came up, eyed him, and passed into the inn. Gautran was eating at a little table in the open air. Presently the innkeeper came out and looked at him. Then the innkeeper's wife did the same. Then other men and women came and cast wrathful glances upon him. At first he was not conscious that he was being thus observed, he was so ravenously engaged, but his hunger being appeased, he raised his head, and saw 7 or 8 persons standing at a little distance from him, and all with their eyes fixed upon his face. "What are you staring at?" he cried. "Did you never see a hungry man eat before?" They did not answer him, but stood whispering among themselves. The idea occurred to Gautran to take away with him a supply of food, and he called to the innkeeper to bring it to him. Instead of doing so, the innkeeper removed the plates and glasses in which the meal had been served. Having done this, he joined the group, and stood apart from Gautran without addressing a word to him. "Do you hear me?" shouted Gautran. "Are you deaf and dumb?" "Neither deaf nor dumb," replied the innkeeper. "We hear you plain enough." "Bring me the bread and meat, then," he said. "Not another morsel," said the innkeeper. "Be off with you." "When I get the food." "You will get none here, nor would you have had bite or sup if I had known." "Known what?" demanded Gautran fiercely. "Is not my money as good as another man's?" "No." "Why?" "Because there is blood upon it." If this did not convince him that his name was known and execrated, what next transpired would have enlightened him. The innkeeper's wife came out with a glass and 2 plates in her hands. "Are these the things," she asked of her husband, "the monster has been eating out of?" "Yes," replied the innkeeper. She dashed them to the ground and shivered them to pieces, and the onlookers applauded the act. "Why do you do that, mistress?" cried Gautran. "So that honest men shall not be poisoned," was the answer, "by eating out of a murderer's dish or putting their lips to a murderer's glass." And the onlookers again applauded her, and kicked away the pieces. Gautran glared at the men and women, and asked, "Who do you take me for?" "For Gautran. There is but one such monster. If you do not know your own face, look upon it there." She pointed to the window, and there he beheld his own portrait, cut out of an illustrated newspaper, and beneath it his name, Gautran, to which had been added, in writing, the words, "The murderer of Madeline, the flower girl." He could not read the inscription, but he correctly divined its nature. The moment before he saw his portrait, it had entered his mind to deny himself. He recognised now how futile the attempt would be. "What if I am Gautran?" he exclaimed. "Do you think the law would set me free if I was guilty?" To which the innkeeper's wife replied, "You have escaped by a quibble. You are a murderer, and you know yourself to be one." "Mistress," he said, "if I had you alone I would make you smart." "How does that sound, men?" cried the innkeeper's wife with excited gestures. "Is it the speech of an innocent man? He would like to get me alone. Yes, he got one poor girl alone, and we know what became of her. The coward! The murderer! Hunt him away, neighbours. It is a disgrace to look upon him." They advanced towards Gautran threateningly, and he drew his knife and snapped it open. "Who will be the first?" he asked savagely, and seeing that they held together, he retreated backwards, with his face to them, until a turn in the road hid them from his sight. Then he fled into the woods, and with wild cries slashed the trees with his knife, which he had sharpened in the early morning. On the second occasion he presented himself at a cottage door with the intention of begging or buying some food. He knocked at the door, and not receiving an answer, lifted the latch. In the room were two children, a baby in a cradle, and a 5-year-old boy sitting on the floor, playing with a little wooden soldier. Looking up and seeing the features of the ruffian, the boy scrambled to his feet, and rushing past Gautran, ran screaming down the road. Enraged almost to madness, Gautran ran after the child, and catching him, tossed him in the air, shouting, "What? You too, brat? This for your pains!" and standing over the child was about to stamp upon him, when he found himself seized by the throat. It was the father, who, hearing the child's screams, came up just in time to save him. Then ensued a desperate struggle, and Gautran, despite his boast to the Advocate, found that he had met more than his match. He was beaten to the ground, lifted, and thrown into the air, as he had thrown the child. He rose, bruised and bleeding, and was slinking off, when the man cried, "Holy Mother! It is the murderer, Gautran!" Some labourers who were coming across the fields were attracted by the scuffle, and the father called out to them, "Here is Gautran, the murderer, and he has tried to murder my child." This was enough for them. They were armed with reaping hooks, and they raced towards Gautran with loud threats. They chased him for full a mile, but he was fleeter of foot than they, and despair gave him strength. He escaped them, and sank panting to the ground. The Advocate had spoken truly. There was no safety for him. He was known for miles round, and the people were eager for vengeance. He would hide in the woods for the rest of the day. There was but one means of escape for him. He must seek some distant spot, where he and his crime were unknown. But to get there he would be compelled to pass through villages in which he would be recognised. It was necessary that he should disguise himself. In what way could this be done? He pondered upon it for hours. In the afternoon he heard the muttering of the thunder in the distant mountains. "There's a storm coming," he said, and he raised his burning face to meet the welcome rain. But only a few heavy drops fell, and the wind moaned through the woods as if in pain. Night stole upon him swiftly, and wrapped him in horrible darkness. He bit his lips, he clenched his hands, his body shook with fear. Solitude was worse than death to him. He tried to sleep, in vain. Terrible images crowded upon him. Company he must have, at all hazards. Suddenly he thought of John Vanbrugh, the man he had met the night before on the hill not far from the Advocate's house. This man had not avoided him. He would seek him again, and if he found him, would pass the night with him. So resolving, he walked with feverish steps toward the hill on which John Vanbrugh was keeping watch. Chapter 3. Gautran resolves on a plan of escape. The distance was longer than Gautran had calculated, and he did not shorten it by the devious tracks he took in his anxiety to avoid meeting with his enemies. The rainstorm still kept off, but in spite of the occasional flashes of lightning, the darkness seemed to grow thicker and thicker, and he frequently missed his way. He kept on doggedly, however, and although the shadow of his crime waited upon his steps, and made itself felt in the sighing and moaning of the wind, in the bending of every branch, and in the fluttering of every leaf, the craving for human companionship in which there was something of sympathy, and from which he would not be hunted like a dog, imbued him with courage to fight these terrors. Often, indeed, did he pause and threaten with fearful words the spectre of the girl he had murdered, and sometimes he implored her to leave him, and told her he was going to pay for masses for the repose of her soul. Occasionally he was compelled to take the high road, and then he was grateful for the darkness, for it prevented his face from being seen. At those times he slunk close to the hedges, as though dreading that the slightest contact with a human being would lead to discovery. Terrible as the night was to him, he feared the approach of day, when it would be more difficult to conceal himself from his pursuers. He knew that his life was not safe while he remained in this fatal neighbourhood. He must escape, and in disguise, before he was many hours older. How was this to be accomplished? Once, in the roadway, he followed with stealthy steps two men who were conversing. He would have avoided them, as he had avoided others, had it not been that he heard his name mentioned, and was morbidly curious to hear what they were saying about him. Said one, "I have not set eyes upon this man monster, but I shall know him if I meet him in the light." To which the other replied, "How will you manage that if you have never seen his face?" "You ask a foolish question. Have not full descriptions of the murderer been put about everywhere? His features, the colour of his hair, his clothes, from his cap to his boots, all is known. His face he might disguise by the slash of his knife, if he has courage enough for it, or he might stain it, and in that way, too, he might change the colour of his hair. But his clothes would remain. The shirt he wears is 1 in 1,000, and there's no mistaking it. It is blue, with broad yellow bands, which encircle his villainous body like rings. Let him get another shirt if he can. The country is aroused for 20 miles around, and men are resolved to take justice into their own hands. The law has allowed him to slip through its fingers. He shall not slip through ours. Why, he said to a woman this morning that he would know how to serve her if he had her alone, and not long afterwards he tried to murder a child. Shall such a monster be allowed to remain at liberty to strike women down and murder the helpless? No, we don't intend to let him escape. Men are on the watch for him everywhere, and when he is caught he will be beaten to death, or hung upon the nearest tree. There is another end for him, if he chooses to take it. He can hide in the woods and starve, and when his body is found, we'll drive a stake through it. Take my word for it, Gautran the murderer has not long to live." Gautran shook with fear and rage. "I could spring upon them with my knife," he thought, "but they are 2 to 1." And then, when the men were out of hearing, he shook his fist at them and muttered, "Curse you! I will cheat you yet." But how? The description given of his shirt was a faithful one. The broad yellow bands were there, and he remembered that 2 days before the end of his trial the gaolers had taken it from his cell in the night, and returned it to him in the morning, washed, with the yellow colour brighter than it had been for months. He knew now that this had been done out of malice, in case he should be acquitted, so that he might be the more readily recognised and shunned, or the more easily tracked and caught if he was again wanted. There loomed upon him a way to foil those who had vowed to kill him. The man he was seeking had spoken in a reckless manner. He had complained of the world, and was doubtless in want of money. He had gold which the Advocate had given him. He would offer to buy the man's clothes, and would give him his own, and 1, 2, or even 3 gold pieces in exchange. An easy thing to accomplish. But if the man would not consent to the bargain? He smiled savagely, and felt the edge of his knife. He was thoroughly desperate. He would sacrifice 1,000 lives to save his own. Out of this murderous alternative, and out of the words uttered by the man he had overheard, his face he might disguise by the slash of his knife if he has the courage for it, grew ideas, which, as he plodded on gradually, arranged themselves into a scheme which would ensure him an almost sure escape from those who had leagued themselves against him. Its entire success depended upon certain physical attributes in John Vanbrugh, but he would risk it, even if these were not as he wished them to be. The plan was horrible in its design, and needed strength and cunning. He had both, and would use them without mercy to ensure his safety. John Vanbrugh, with whose name he was not acquainted, was probably a stranger in the locality. Something in Vanbrugh's speech caused him to suspect this. He would assure himself first of the fact, and then the rest was easy. Vanbrugh was about his own height and build. He had stood by his side, and knew this to be so. Gautran should die this night in the person of another man, and should be found in the morning, murdered, with features so battered as to defy recognition. But he would be attired in Gautran's clothes, and would by those means be instantly identified. Then he, the true Gautran, would be forever safe. In John Vanbrugh's garments he could make his way to a distant part of the country, and take another name. No one would suspect him, for Gautran would be dead, and he would buy masses for the repose of Madeline's soul, and so purge himself of blood guiltiness. As to this second contemplated crime he gave it no thought, except that it was necessary, and must be done. End of Section 26